Guys, let's go ahead and pick up where we stopped. We're talking about civil rights, Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, little Jackie Robinson, and of course the ultimate civil rights leader, Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this is about where we finished last time. 1954, Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. I told you at the very end, I kind of forgot, but it was based on the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause of citizenship. In 1954, this little African-American girl and her family sued the Board of Education in Topeka, saying that her segregated school was not equal. The Supreme Court ruled with actually the Brown family and said it was inherently unequal. Segregation of children in public schools on the basis of race is not only unconstitutional, but it's discriminatory, and basically these states were ordered to integrate their schools. Now, I did tell you at the very end of the last video that I'd give you a little spoiler alert that this actually isn't the first court case to say it did go down in history as basically the only one. There are two things I need you to add out beside this slide. Are you ready? Okay, the first one is Sweatt, S-W-E-A-T-T versus Painter. Okay, Sweatt versus Painter, and all you need to really write down out beside that is going to be African American denied entrance into UT law. Okay, this one is actually going to be in the early 1950s, and this man is African American. I'll tell you more in class, but he basically says, I need to be able to go to a law school, but there's no law school for African Americans, so there is no separate but equal. That actually ends up being ruled in favor of him. He has to be admitted to UT law, so that was a victory. The next one you need to make sure you write down, are you ready? Is Delgado versus Bastrop ISD. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Delgado versus Bastrop ISD. It's a little girl named Minerva Delgado. Obviously, that name is not African American. It's Hispanic. Literally, that court case, and I believe that was in the end of the 40s, that one is identical to Brown versus Board of Education, except for it's not a little African American girl. It's a little Hispanic girl. Now, there is one thing in particular that I want you to write after we get, watch after we get some of this stuff done. Brown versus Board of Education is going to stop integration and stop segregation and integrate all of the schools. The one thing I also want us to add down, and I didn't even give you a slide for it, but write it down, is the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It's going to be passed by Eisenhower. Here he is right here. It's the first civil rights legislation since the Civil War amendments, and it outlaws segregation in public places. Now, there is one thing that I really want to stress to you guys. Just because the federal law is passing Brown versus Board of Education, and just because Eisenhower and Congress are passing civil rights acts, does that mean the South is going to do it? No. The South often does what it wants to, and remember the old saying, the South will rise again. Now, let me introduce you to 9 people who lived through it. Pause this, get it down. They're going to be in the video. The Little Rock 9. 9 African American students who are going to be testing the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in Little Rock, Arkansas at Central High School. Now, they are going to literally be the first attendees of the first integrated high school in the South. Now, in 1958, they are going to be starting their school year, and I'm going to let the video kind of do most of my teaching for me. But literally, they get attacked. Look at this picture right here in particular. This is the one I always look at. Beautiful girl. You're going to find out her name is Elizabeth Eckford. And look at the anger on that girl's face. Literally, it got so bad outside Little Rock, Arkansas, so unbelievably bad, that President Eisenhower has to send in the federal troops to accompany the 9 black students in to make sure they're safe. And here you can see pictures of the national troops. Okay, the federal troops there, the National Guard. Really, honestly, one of the biggest moves Eisenhower does to basically help civil rights, and it is a stance by the federal government. Literally, these African American students were basically being subjected to a hate mob. This is kind of a really cool picture I found. It is present day Central High School, by the way, still open, and in the middle of it they kind of superimpose that old school picture of those 9 African Americans, the Little Rock 9, being allowed entrance in. Now, there's a couple more things before we kind of get through this. I'm going to let you watch the video at the very end. The last thing that's going to be part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil disobedience is going to be something called a sit-in. We'll talk more about it in class, but in the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, sit-ins are going to start in Greensboro, North Carolina. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Jackie Robinson, the Little Rock 9, Brown versus Board of Education. The whole goal is to beat the civil rights legislation at its own game. What the idea is it is literally to take and fight civil rights in a way in which the African Americans don't look bad, but rather the whites look bad. And take a look at this picture. The story behind sit-ins. It is literally the fact that blacks were not allowed to sit at lunch counters because of Jim Crow laws. Remember those down in the South? So with that, when Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is passed, technically segregation is not supposed to be legal anymore. Well, these African Americans go in North Carolina and in the South, and they go and sit at the lunch counters. Well, many whites say, no, you're not welcome here. Well, then they're like, oh no, we're welcome here and legally we can be here. But instead of getting up in people's faces and throwing things and throwing a massive fit, the African Americans just sit there silently, calmly, dressed nicely, and all they say is, I would like to order, I would like to order. And the whites just start coming. They mob, they throw food at them, they squirt ketchup on them, they do all kinds of unbelievable things to these poor people. And when pictures like this go down in the newspapers and now in textbooks when we study them, who looks wrong? The whites or the blacks? Of course the whites do. They are basically fighting the civil rights in the right way. Is this more Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois? I think it's probably a little bit more Booker T. Washington with a little bit of Du Bois added in there. The civil rights movement in the Greensboro sit-ins, the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Brown versus Board of Education, the NAACP filing lawsuits like, Sweat versus Painter and Brown versus Board and Delgado versus Bastrop ISD, the action of the Little Rock 9, and of course Eisenhower taking up that effect. And these sit-ins in particular really show you, okay, that they are willing to fight it. And they're not only willing to fight it violently, that's not the answer for them. It's them to fight it passively, to make sure that they approach it and not leave the question out there, but to say we deserve these rights. Look at how they're dressed here. And then look at this sign. Fountain closed. That's what they used to call a lunch counter, soda fountain. Closed in the interest of public what? Safety. All because African Americans were sitting there. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie The Help, but oh my gosh, it is unbelievably good. It is one of the ones that I would highly suggest. In fact, that'd be a good movie lunch. But here's the last thing. I want you to watch this. I'm going to ask you one question out of this when you get to class, so you better watch this video. But it is the story of basically school integration.
An event that forever altered the course of race relations in America. As our image reveals itself, the 1957 school year is about to begin, and an angry mob is trying to stop 9 black students from entering Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The question I usually get asked is, were we scared? I think initially we didn't anticipate clearly all of the violence and turmoil that occurred. The first day that we attempted to go to school, 8 of us were at one part of the school, and Elizabeth Eckford was at another part, and it was the mob that followed Elizabeth. Then you begin to feel that this was a very hostile, violent group of people. Even at that point, I told myself that if we didn't go through with it, didn't attend Central and backed out, it would just reinforce the view that the African American community in Little Rock wasn't interested in making a change in things.
There's some really
During
famous
the
videos.
1950s, African Americans throughout the country were trying to make their voices heard.
We've
the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, do now and will continue to carry on our mass protest.
The driver demanded that I give this seat up to a white man. I didn't feel that I was being treated as a human being. I refused to give up this seat. I said no.
Miss Rosa Parks.
Little Rock was a year after the Montgomery bus boycott. So we had seen the impact of Rosa Parks and the beginning of Dr. King's career, and knew that things could change.
All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet.
The first step for the Little Rock Nine came in May 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued its opinion in the landmark case Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Separate but equal was inherently unequal, and integration was now the law of the land. In 1957, this decision and the power of the federal government were tested in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Pay attention here.
We didn't, at the moment we were selected, have any idea it was going to be as difficult as it turned out to be.
In the face of protest at Central High School, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, calls out the National Guard. His official reasoning is to preserve the peace and prevent violence.
It clearly wasn't to protect us. It was to make a symbolic stand. It was to protect the way of life in the South, because they barred our entrance.
Hoping to throw open these school doors, President Dwight Eisenhower does the unprecedented. He calls in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army.
I think President Eisenhower wanted to show that the federal government was supreme in this. And they could have done what they needed to do with 100 troops. But 1,000 paratroopers was really meant to send a message.
1,000 paratroopers.
Under the guard of the U.S. Army, the students are finally able to do something seemingly very simple: go to school. But it would not be easy for Ernest Green or his 8 fellow black students.
School was like going to war every day. The walks from class to class were where, you had a lot of harassment, a lot of physical violence.
But Ernest Green persevered, becoming the first black graduate of Central High School with the class of 1958. Green would eventually go on to a successful banking career and government service in the Carter administration.
Isn't that
But in
cool?
1958, integration was not complete in Little Rock. The following year, Governor Faubus closed all public schools in Arkansas instead of complying with desegregation. Schools in Arkansas would not be fully integrated until 1972. Yet, the world would always remember these 9 students who, by claiming their place in the classroom, were claiming their place in history.
Attending Central was special in the sense that it was part of history. It was part of a change. This was reverberating all over the country, all over the world.
At the very end of that video there, they're holding hands, and I do believe, I mean, you can't hear them, but there was a civil rights, basically, anthem, and it's actually a church. Well, Dr. King was a minister, and it was entitled "We Shall Overcome." So, long story short, civil rights, it won't be easy, it won't be short, but it will start happening right about now. The stuff I hope you got out of that video, hope you got that the governor's name, Orville Faubus, and 1,000 paratroopers were called in by Eisenhower. Obviously, old General Eisenhower isn't going to take some itty-bitty southern governor saying he can't do something. He's the president of the United States. Supreme Court demanded that schools be integrated, and that's exactly what Eisenhower was going to see done in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the Little Rock 9. Tune in for the last video next.